And thus, could the solution here be linked to a more globalized solution for Africa in dealing with that past? 6. On page 6, you mentioned that in the Vi area, there was a need for power to enforce peace. Could we conclude that the coming of the settlers and that the process of disputes and struggles from 1847 with the Declaration of Liberia as a nation state to the recent 21st century globalization trend has been, in a sense, just a natural process of acculturation linked to imposing the rule of law throughout a global state? Could all of this be a necessary part of what we call human development as a whole towards a unified, non-conflicting global society, considering the patterns of statehood working from the city-state, like the tribal chiefdoms, etc., coming to a nation-state, and now going to what we call the UN or United States? You know, I'm trying to look at that, because that power to be, if they didn't have that power, then how could they have brought about that larger scale of rule of law to quench the lower level conflicts? So it would seem that it's like a process that is naturally taking place. I'd like Vito, if you have any comments on that point. If not, then what other power are you talking about? This is my concern. Another point, I would like to give comment on this issue of land. You mentioned about land being land boundaries. You know, we notice in the UN system, they talk about rights, and ownership of property is a right, but it's an individual right in a sense. But many of the tribes have this group right of property ownership. Is there some way that this can be harmonized somehow, or do you see any struggle with this? It's another point of concern I have. Thank you. Those are my questions.
If I may, I'd like to have you let us go back to I've heard now sort of the general frame. If we could go back to each individual question, rather than my trying to synthesize here, so that I can make sure that I deal with specifically what you're after. Let's talk about the first one first, you're asking me, if I'm correct, what is the single most significant cause for conflict? Am I correct here? Let's have a conversation about this, and so that I understand fully what your question is, and then I'll try to respond.
Yeah, you know, I see from your presentation that the whole key point is that these boundaries and separations amongst ourselves seems to be the factor of conflict. If there were no boundaries, if there was this harmonized coexistence type environment, conflict would not be so prevalent. So, and you mentioned different levels of boundaries, you know, the language barrier, the cultural issues, the ethnic issue, the land ownership issue, the gender issue, the spiritual issues. So, you know, so I'm trying to understand that, could we summarize this as a general alienation from our essential self? Meaning, is there some higher order wholeness that humanity can reach one day where there will be no boundaries? And if it doesn't exist, then are we to just live with the fact that conflict will be a natural thing, and we just have to deal with the so-called retributive justice idea of just, you know, getting rid of the conflicting elements, putting them aside, and dealing with whatever we have at hand? So this kind of discussion I'm looking at.
All right. I don't think we'll ever avoid conflict until we get to heaven. I think that it's innate in our social selves and in our social systems. We always will find mechanisms to differentiate ourselves from each other, depending on what the issue is, what the purpose is, what what our aspirations are, and so on. And what I'm trying to get at, admittedly, I use this as a tool to try to get at understanding how Liberia came to the Civil War. But I think that, we all use differences, our differences in varying ways and differing situations. The point is to find mechanisms whereby those conflicts are kept to a minimum and in which violence is avoided. I think it is sort of inherent in all of us that we recognize that we are not all exactly the same, and we all have aspirations to achieve in some way or another, or to get ahead, and so we use sometimes in more gentle forms, sometimes in more aggressive ways, these differences to our advantage. The point ultimately is, and that's why we will have a legal system, and why we have a mechanism for adjudicating disputes, because disputes, I think, are inherent. The point is, first of all, to either alleviate or to minimize violence, open violence, to learn how to talk to each other, as opposed to fighting with each other. There's this phrase that violence is the language of the inarticulate, and we have to become articulate. We have to be able to talk. And so that's what I would address here in terms of pointing out these areas of conflict, is looking for ways to mitigate them, to dampen them, to minimize them to whatever extent is possible within the system. But there always are going to be areas where there is tension or friction. And I don't think it's inherent to Liberia. I think it's inherent in all social systems. Part of the reason why one has a governance, one has governments, one has political structures, is to try to handle these kinds of tensions that exist within any society.
So in a sense, that's why the rule of law is the minimizing factor, in a sense.
Exactly. And I would argue that Liberia has never had, except within the colonial settlements of the 19th century, has never had effective rule of law. That was one of the weaknesses of the past system, that now Liberia has the opportunity to change fundamentally, to create a system of a legal system across the country where everybody has access to a trusted and open system to arbitrate their disputes.
So number one, I understand. Thank you.
Okay, let's go on to the second then. And remind me, you framed it in terms of settlers coming to Liberia from a background of racism.
Yeah, I was just wondering whether do you think that could have had an effect on their inability to, because they came with these Christian values, so one would have thought that the Christian values would have dominated them, but we see instead that they became overpowered with the reality they met on the ground, and they just sort of isolated themselves. So I was wondering whether any way you could have seen that the way they were treated in the past could have influenced them in treating people they met with diversity in a similar way,
I don't know that there have been very many harmonious Christian communities if you look back into the past in terms of Christianity. Christianity has been used as a tool very often. But be that as it may, of course, I would argue, and in the book that I wrote with Bernie Herman and Max Belcher on settler architecture, taking this one small aspect of returned American Africans, if you like, to use a new terminology here. They came as Americans. They happened to be black, but they came as Americans. And of course, they came as black Americans, and you're right to say that they came out of a racist system. There's no question about that. But they came with values and understandings of the system that they knew, that they grew up in. And it's very similar to the kinds of concepts I'm talking about in terms of others within Liberian society who have a background, and then the question is, how do you change that background to a new situation? I think they came and we can have a long discussion about this with attitudes both of being Christian, civilized human beings facing un-Christian peoples of Africa, and all of that stood for in terms of what the Western world, Europe, Western world, saw in terms of other parts of the world. They came with those kinds of values, and so they saw Liberians, or people within Liberia, as being these people who were un-Christian, but that they had the potential to be saved. The irony of this is in the Vai area, which is the area that I did my dissertation on and know quite well, the Vai people, having had chattel slavery, saw these people as their returned slaves. And in the Vai area, if familiar, chattel slaves in the past were very low status. And so they saw themselves as the civilized ones, and these returned Americans as their former slaves. So you have this very interesting situation where people are talking past each other and not talking to each other. In terms of course they came, there were people, they came with Christian values, which meant that they wanted to work with and to convert the people living in darkness, I don't know that they came, that was ever done forcefully. There may be exceptions to what I'm saying here, but they came with the idea of trying to change the ways of the people who didn't understand the true way. But there were also issues of, because they came with the true culture in the true way, they looked down upon the ways of the people who were here. And that inevitably had impact in terms of the nature of the relationship, how they treated and how they looked at the people who were here. And there are, of course, overtones of their past experience in which they now are in a position to reverse roles, and so they now are the dominant master towards the local people who were seen in the category of not slaves necessarily, but certainly of low status. So there is that, of course, but you can also find exceptions in the settler community. And if one looks carefully at the nature of the interaction between the communities, yes, there was some conflict. Obviously, the settlers were trying to change the economic system of the people along the coast here, so they were trying to forbid trade in slaves. So that obviously was an immediate clash over an economic issue. But there are also issues where people are reaching out and wanting to, for us, bring in wards, for instance, to live with them, to become educated and Christian. And there are people living on the communities, the settler communities upriver and in the more isolated communities down the coast and so on, who are trying to interact with local people on a daily basis. Need for labor on coffee plantations and rubber and sugar plantations. The need for helping in obtaining food, rice, and so on. So, where it was important to have a relationship that was a stable one and a friendly one. So I think you can get a spectrum. The general opinion, obviously, as we sort of think of it today, is one of hostility. And we see it only in negative terms. And maybe, as a whole, it may have been. But basically what you have are two differing cultures, two differing ways of life that have come into conflict. They come into conflict. And the issue is how to find ways to bridge that area of conflict. I gave a talk back in 1977 here in Monrovia, talking about two worldviews in the process of integration. And I was looking at this obviously before the coup and before this very major change that occurred, but in which there were obviously certain attempts that were being done by the national government, national integration, etc. etc., etc. But at the same time, there also clearly were disparities between how one group looked at the other, and maybe even vice versa. I don't know if that helps in answering your question, but that's where I would at least start our conversation.
Well, thank you. I just wanted to understand whether that could have been a factor in your research as you had experience.
Well, it's certainly in the back of my mind. I chose not to dwell on it today because I suspect that my colleagues are going to spend more time on that particular issue. And I have probably more experience with working with people of, to use the old term, of the hinterland. I have been in every county of Liberia except River Cess, for no good reason, not having been to River Cess, but I haven't been to River Cess. And so I have spent a lot of time working with people across the country. I was doing social institutional mapping in the early 80s, and I have also done work in the Bandi country in intensive historical work as well as in the Bandi. So my major focus and my major experiences that I certainly know about the settler history and so on. I spent time on it, but I chose quite deliberately not to talk about that conflicted boundary because I thought that would be addressed by others. Let's go on to the next. I'm not sure that I can really read my notes here.
The next one was just, we realized that change is necessary, but you brought the element that change has to be linked to the cultural factor because you can't change one without the other. So my concern was, besides this issue of rule of law, is there any other essential point in this change from a cultural perspective, this transformation, that is important besides just coming and imposing a set of rules and say, okay, everybody got to follow this? How do you deal with that undermining factor?
Well, that's why I chose to talk about this issue of intellectual unification. Right? And I selectively chose the issue of national history as a mechanism to begin to work at a national culture, a sense of Liberia as a nation state, but in which all Liberians are equal and part of this nation state, and ultimately with an understanding of each other, respect for each other. That has to underlie the rule of law. If that doesn't exist, if people continue to see themselves as distinct communities separate from each other, there is going to be a much higher level of tension. Law can be used to implement the dampening of some of that tension, but obviously, ultimately, one wants to move to a society that is an integrated society in which everybody respects each other and understands each other. So I chose to use the issue of history as one. I chose the other issue just as a simple example of getting students to move around the country, live in other parts of the country, and get to know each other. Because it is very clear that Liberians don't know each other. And that becomes very important, as part of the sense of nationhood and of Liberia as a distinct entity, just from that of other areas. So that's, I think, some examples that I would pick, other than law, as a mechanism to try to begin to heal and to get people to understand and know each other, to bridge some of these troubled boundaries. And then there are undoubtedly other ways as well. Just the building of roads, the ability for people to move from one part of the country to the other, the fact that the president is getting the cabinet out from Monrovia and begin to see that Monrovia is not the center of everything, that there has to be power distributed to other parts of the country, and that there has to be a sharing of governance and a respect for each other's sharing of governance. Those are some other issues. I probably could think of some other things, but no. So I'm not saying that law is the end all here.
No, thank you. That's a very important point, especially the concept of us getting our own type of identity. Because obviously, historically, we seem never to have gotten something.
That's right.
We're all stuck with these different cliches of identities, but we haven't found what is this Liberia?
Yeah.
What are we? Who are we as a whole?
What makes us a Liberian as opposed to a Sierra Leonean or a Ghanaian and so on. That's right.
Thank you.
And so there has to be pride in self. There has to be pride for achievements that have occurred, some of which I pointed out as possibilities, but there are obviously other ways as well.
And my next one was about this class distinction. I didn't hear you mention much about classism. Has that been a real factor also? Or?
Yeah, I chose to speak of it in a slightly different way in terms of status, I think, social status, to try to broaden the issue. But basically I was talking, and I think I mentioned rich and poor, and people with power and people not with power, and people with access to health care as opposed to people not didn't have access to health care, and so on. Class is obviously a very important one here, and what we had in the power holders of the past was very much a class, juxtaposed against others who were not part of that class. But I think it's broader than just class. I think there were other kinds of distinctions going on here, and that's why I chose not to speak specifically about class. The social differentiation, so absolutely has existed here. And again, I would argue, and that's part of all of this, and hopefully part of your task is to try to figure out ways to dampen that, to ameliorate it, to make it less important. To be conscious of the fact, in this new Liberia, for instance, that there are not certain people who become super rich and people who remain super poor, but that one moves to a society in which everybody has access to a decent income and to a decent way of life.
Okay, thank you very much. The next one had to do with this comparing the situation of the settlers and their local problems with the natives, and that similar situation with the white colonial rule in Africa as a whole. Do you see any kind of little similarity, and therefore could there be a similar need that needs to be put
There's been a book written about this. It's always problematic when you try to compare one area or one situation with another, but there has been discussion about Liberia being ruled by black colonials as opposed to white colonials, and there are some similarities, and each group came with a set of a cultural background that was different from the local people, and they came into a position of ruling and dominating the people who were already here, and to impose institutions upon local peoples, some of which I have pointed out here. There is a difference, though. The people who came from America saw themselves, in a sense, as coming home, even if it wasn't the specific place in Africa that their ancestors came from. Increasingly, we're probably going to be able to identify more and more of where people came from, but certainly in the 19th century they weren't able to. So there was a sense of homecoming on the part of these settlers. That was certainly not the case of Europeans coming to Africa and dominating. There was, I think, at a certain level, a sense of, to use an older phrase, brotherhood, a brotherhood and sisterhood, because of shared race. Although I suspect that most indigenous Liberians didn't see them as didn't see race as significant, because race has not been significant internally within Liberian society, because there was no basis upon making racial distinctions. So that was not significant to local people. And in fact, if you look at some of the local languages, and I'll speak specifically about Vai people speak of Bomueno. Bomueno are people who are Westerners. They're the white people. It didn't matter. And so the settlers were referred to as Bomueno because they were culturally from the West, even though they were black-skinned. But certainly from the point of view of the settlers, many of them saw themselves as coming home. Of course, many saw this as an asylum, as a way to escape the racism of America, and certainly after the Civil War, even before, but in Reconstruction, it was terrible social situations that people were in. with a great deal of violence, and escaping to Liberia was an alternative for people who escaped after the Nat Turner Rebellion, or another group who came here to seek asylum. And so as a consequence, those seeking asylum saw this as a place to live, but not necessarily, they didn't come with the motivation of reaching out to their brothers and sisters necessarily. So that makes it distinct from that of the white colonials coming to Africa, who came as strangers and chose to impose upon them.
I was talking about the fact that they both used that same strategy of dividing and adding more boundaries to the already boundary-ridden environment. You know, by segregating, making artificial national boundaries between tribes that were existing, and creating economic boundaries that shouldn't have been there, and all this kind of thing.
Well, they certainly picked used the British colonial model of indirect rule, which led to then creating political entities that may not have existed before, and in the creating of those entities, obviously they then had boundaries which they may not have had before, because there was much more flexible fluidity between peoples, and as I pointed out, then you created conflict because you created boundaries, and that's typical of course of the other colonial governments. Now they thought they were doing good by that, in the sense that this was a way to interact with local people through a pre-existing system, so that they weren't disturbing the local system. Unlike the French, just in neighboring Guinea, that basically destroyed the whole chieftaincy system and basically created a series of geographical units, cercles, and then imposed their own rule on that. They didn't use the British model. In either case, though, there is the imposition of a new form of a new social system upon the pre-existing system. So there is an imposition here, and in that sense, there is the cause for conflict, for a new level of conflict. They saw themselves also as, and still in that mindset of the 19th century, and maybe even early 20th century, of converting people to be like themselves, becoming Christians and being, civilized people. I remember distinctly, actually not all that long ago, a person from down the coast who was a representative talking about his benighted brethren living in darkness. And he's talking about his own people, but because he's a Christian, he saw himself as distinct from those who were not Christians. Now, this was a person who was actually from that area, but who had taken on, if you like, the mindset of the settlers.
And linked to number 7, wouldn't this be a natural reality when you're trying to create that harmonious whole process? Like even now, we talk about culture of peace as compared to a culture of violence and hatred. So when you deal with these cultural elements, you can't help but deal with transforming people's values. We need universal values as a ground for our unity. Otherwise, there can be no unity. So it was a natural process from their point of view to acculturate the people with what they knew to be best. I'm not saying that it was the best, but that was what they knew to be best.
That's right.
Christian values.
Yeah.
So as we strive now in this modern age to move forward to a final globalized society, what other options do we have? What about bringing people together centered around certain core principles or values, what is called today human rights or whatever?
Yeah. Well, one of the things, of course, that is happening is that Western education is being brought across the country. So there's a new generation that is learning Western education, Western values, Western ways, as opposed to traditional ways. Ultimately, the option I think here is, and the one that I think is happening in other parts of the world, is to become tolerant of each other's diversity. There is no reason to do or even hope for homogenization so that everybody is the same. But we have to. But there is a movement to be tolerant of and to understand and to accept diversity and to work together and and in fact have pride in diversity, as opposed to the traditional way that my way is the only way and the best way, and yours is the wrong way. And I think that's what we're seeing in the globalization process. There are being imposed, as you're well aware, a certain international standards of behavior. The Human Rights Charter being one example of that, where there is the demand that certain behavior exists in all parts of the world. That's being, if you like, some people would characterize this as a new colonialism, as something that's being forced on the diverse peoples of the world. But on the other hand, it is a mechanism also for the diverse peoples of the world to get along with each other. So there's sort of the good and the bad. Forced change, nobody likes forced change, but in point of fact, in the long term, my sense is that this is what is necessary for us to live with each other in this shrinking world. So that Liberia becomes a microcosm of the larger process. And Liberia is in some ways the early stage of this process of learning to get along with each other. And certainly the new government here is very important in stressing these kinds of values, which from my point of view I think are very good. I don't know if that answers it, but I hope it does.
No, I mean, it adds to the topic. Thank you, because I believe ultimately, like you just said in the end, some new type of acculturation or spiritual, what they call colonialization. I believe the final age as we go towards globalization is like a spiritual acculturation, where we can all have a common inner spirit that will blend with our outer actions.
Again, accepting the wide variety of ways in which people worship God, or in which people see the spirit world as significant and important to themselves, being tolerant of each other in that. But yes, there is that aspect.
Thank you.
Because in a sense, sorry.
No, go ahead.
Because in a sense, one has to have pride in self also. You can't diminish that. You can't undermine that in people getting along with each other. They still have to be allowed to have a sense of themselves that may not be exactly the same as the next person. But we have to be tolerant, so long as it doesn't go against certain sets of standards that we feel ought to be world standards. Thank you, sorry.
Thank you also.
Thank you, Professor Holsoe, for coming all the way here to help enriching our work. And we're very pleased to have you. My name is Commissioner John Stewart. I would like for you to, first of all, my question is, and I will want to look at pre-settler Liberia, since we have a mandate to conduct a review of our history and to remove those considered as myths, the proper history. And because a lot of the problems that we have experienced today are in a way related to those of pre-settler Liberia and then settler Liberia, I want to ask, how did the Almoravid invasions and the jihadists...
I'm sorry, I didn't catch the word.
The Almoravids, ALMORAVIDS. Well, the invasions from Northern Africa, bringing down
the
Islam.
Almoravids.
Yeah, Almoravids.
Okay, got you now.
And
sorry.
the activities of jihadists in that time. How did it impact, what should I say, state formation in pre-settler Liberia? And as well as how did it affect migration patterns into what is now known as Liberia?
Okay. I'm not sure that it's necessarily the Almoravids, but certainly that the things that were occurring in the Sahel and in the far interior for Liberia had impact on the peopling of Liberia. No question about it. There is both a push and there's a pull that was occurring. There is a push as certain of those empires began to expand. I think particularly in terms of the Mali Empire, as it expanded territory towards the south, towards the forest region. And in that expansion, there was pressure on the people, sort of ahead of that expansion, pushing people southward towards the forest regions. This region has been inhabited, though, for a very, very long time. And unfortunately, there's been very, very limited archaeological work done here in Liberia. But what very little has been done is they're finding pottery that goes back thousands of years. These are people that we have essentially no understanding of at this point because we have so little cultural evidence, because so little work has been done. And it's worked hard to do that kind of work in a forested region. But this area has been inhabited for a very long time, probably by people who were hunters and gatherers. And as pressure was placed on people, and I'm thinking here particularly in terms of Mande-speaking peoples, there was movement pushing people towards the forest region. This was an area where there was new territory, new land available, consequence for farming. And with them they brought new cultural traits. They brought rice farming into the forest region, and they brought agriculture or horticultural technically with them that probably was not here with the earlier peoples. There was also a pull factor, particularly there was a pull factor that once you get to a certain point between the Sahel or the Sahara and the coast, where it is easier to get salt from the coast than it is to get mined salt from the Sahara. Salt is a vital commodity. People cannot live without salt. You can make a kind of salt by burning certain plants, but it is not as effective and as useful as salt that either comes from sodium chloride, which comes either from the ocean or from these mines in the Sahara. And so there was a pull for peoples to come towards the coast to get salt. That was the initial pull. The second important pull, but this comes late, is in the late 1400s, as you begin to get Europeans coming along the coast and wanting to trade. And people then want to get involved in that trade because they gain access to new goods that they didn't have access to before. So that begins to pull people also southward towards the coast. And it's occurring across what is modern-day Liberia, all the way from the south to the northwestern part of Liberia. And with that, the coming of these people, there is obviously social change, there is environmental impact, and there is increasing heterogeneity of peoples. And so what you have then is the peopling of Liberia and of the diverse peopling, so that, as I say, today we officially recognize 16 language groups, but there are probably about 32 in this country as the linguists describe language. Now, many of them in the south and southeast were very small clusters of people because they were living in isolation, and so their languages diverged from other groups. But there was this very great diversity, and we still see the diversity today. Essentially, all of the people that we know that exist in Liberia today, their ancestors came from somewhere else. Well, and even to the far past, but certainly in terms of those that we recognize as peoples of Liberia today, they all came from somewhere else, and mainly they came from the north and northeast and east into Liberia. I don't know if that helps. Does that answer the question? I didn't deal with Islam here, and obviously the Almoravids were Muslims, but it's a very small group of people, and I talked about it briefly here in terms of Mandinka. A few Fula, but mainly Mandinka, or Mandingos, who brought Islam with them.
At what specific period in history can we place the arrival of those migrants, now known as tribes, to this part of the west coast of Africa called Liberia?
It's very difficult, and I'm not sure that we really have fully worked this out. We have a sense that, for instance, the Vai came in the early to mid 1400s, and we know of a linked group to the Vai, the Kono, who exist in northern Sierra Leone, and that they ultimately got split from each other because they speak a northern Mande language that is very close to Vai. From the documentary evidence, we think that they arrived somewhere in the very early 1400s, early to middle. In terms of the others, we have, if you look at the early Liberia, you have an image of Liberia in your head. We know that the Kruan-speaking peoples, these used to be called the Kru-speaking peoples, but it's to distinguish the Kru from the other people who speak similar languages, such as the Day, the Bassa, the Kran, Grebo. We have Day-speaking people into what is modern-day Sherbro in Sierra Leone. In other words, all the way up the coast, beyond the Mono River into Sierra Leone, there were Day communities. So that we have this strip of Kruan-speaking peoples all the way from Sierra Leone southward along the coast, the Day, the Bassa, and then the Kru and the Grebo and the Kran. We also have this other group that was Kru speaking. Today we call them Bele, but they themselves call themselves Kua, that are sitting up there in Bapalo County now, that are separated from their Day and Bassa cousins. And all of that region, intervening region, that is now inhabited by others, was in fact Kruan-speaking peoples. The Gola and the Kisi, the Gola in particular, came from the northern part of Liberia, probably originally from where the Kisi are today, but moved southward first to Congo, and then mainly in the 19th century started moving south into what is today Bome County and across into Montserrat County and Todi area. And there they split off the Bele from their Day cousins as they moved south. The Kisi were moving into what is modern day Liberia, into the area that they are today, and we have evidence of that from the late 18th century and early 19th century. You also have this other, and then you have the Vai moving in across basically what is Sierra Leone into modern day Liberia, but also on the Sierra Leone side in the Sherbro or Galenas area as it used to be called. But then they get cut off from the Kono as you get the Mande speakers, that are today called the Southwestern Mande, the Mende in Sierra Leone, or the small group in Guma, chiefdom in Lofa County, the Bandi, the Loma, spreading in that direction westward. And you have the Bele coming out of modern day Guinea, coming more southward, and in the 19th century pushing in one direction the Gola back to the enclave in Todi, and pushing the Bassa back southwards as they move into what is Bong County and into parts of what are modern-day Maghini. You had from the past a small group, and they still exist. I'm not sure if they're recognized today, given all of the changes that occurred during the Civil War in terms of political jurisdictions. There's this group called the B and the Doro that are part of Nimba County, who are Kruan speakers. They're neighbors to the Kron, and they clearly were a westward extension of the spread of the Kron-speaking Kruan people. And we have in the literature examples of the Kron moving into modern-day Liberia, and in some cases, some of those groups up near the border with the Ivory Coast very recently moving into Liberia. Some moved back also, certainly during the Civil War. There were many who moved back across the border, but there's been a fluidity there. There are, as you know, distinctions between in the southeast between these various groups of Kruan speakers. Liberia recognizes, the government recognizes the Kron, the Grebo, and the Kru. There is a group that has been pushing for a very long time for recognition by the Senate government, the Sapo, who speak a language which is a little different from that of the Kron and the Kru, who are in both Ranjete and in Sino County. So that's an overview of what we know at this point in terms of the peopling of Liberia, pre-settler. But there's a lot that we don't know, and we certainly don't know essentially anything about that earlier population except for the limited number of pottery and of stone tools that have been found in Liberia.
Now, thank you very much. One issue which has played itself out in current day Liberia is, and it's played itself out historically in a historical context as well as in a cultural context, and that has to do with the peopling of Liberia. Now, you mentioned in your presentation that there was a time following the arrival of the settlers, there was much conflict going on in and around the environments in which they found themselves, and the attempt to stabilize the situation around them led them, well, they attempted and I would say succeeded in stabilizing the political entities that later that we know as clans and chiefdoms, and in a way, as you said in your presentation, moving from population control to territorial control, linking territory to people in a way. Now, one issue that has been current within our history and political development, and which is very, very controversial, is the Mandingo question. There are a lot of our kinsmen, Liberians, who look at the Mandingo as foreign elements, when in fact there are evidences in history of their presence here within this region that is currently known as Liberia. And I noticed in your presentation you talked about traders coming, I suppose, from the Sahel, Mandingo traders coming from the Sahel, and inching their way along and bringing along Islam, but in a way that was very tolerant to the diverse groups of people they met. So I would like to ask this question: how did the movement, or how did the paradigm shift from people control to territorial control by the nascent Liberian state? How did it impact? How did it impact the question as well of the Mandingo presence in Liberia, how did it impact that particular issue, taking into consideration their origin and authenticity as residents of pre-settler Liberia?
Okay. Certainly, small groups of Mandingos have been like wandering into Liberia, what is modern-day Liberian territory, for a very long time. I think we can trace certain families back almost 200 years as residents in what is modern-day Liberia. These are not new people who just came. But they came in a manner that where there was greater emphasis on their part in trading than there was in farming. So for them, there was not the need for territory as such, and for a residential area as such. And so traditionally, you didn't have, quote, Mandingo tribal areas. You had Mandingos scattered among peoples in the Vai area, in the Gola area, in the Bandi area, Kisi area, Loma area, and among the Mano, the Namia, and the Dan, the Kio areas. They were coming for trade, coming for salt, coming for cola nuts, back to the Sahel, or to the savannah, and they were coming for gold, for minerals. Now what happens is that with the imposition of so this is a very old population in this country, and it's, I think, one that needs to be emphasized. These Mandingos are as much a part of Liberia as any other group who are here. But with the coming of the central government's imposition of social control over the country, land, territory became important. And Mandingos were, in one sense, in a quandary, because they had not, quote, occupied a territory for the purposes of controlling that particular territory, because they were scattered, because they were basically not farmers. There is a fairly long history to what is the modern-day Kwaduboni up near Banjuma, that chiefdom, that is a Mandingo chiefdom. And there is a contiguous Mandingo chiefdom on the Guinea side. These were contested territories because there were Loma and there were Bele in these areas. But in time, on the Liberian side, that area, because it was heavily populated by Mandingos, came to be recognized by the central government. I think it's not until Barclay's time, Edwin Barclay's time. It may have been in King's time, but I think it's Edwin Barclay's time, as a distinct territory that was Mandingo. That's a fairly recent concept. Then, certainly it was in Barclay's time, and I know a little more about the history of this, because there were a large number of Mandingos scattered in that corridor between the Bandi Loma area, Bopolo, and down towards the St. Paul settlement area today, Vanzwa, for instance, Svend, Vanzwa. There was a move on in the 30s by those people, since chiefdoms were important now in this new system, to have their own chiefdom. And so there is the creation by Barclay of the Mecca chiefdom, or Maka chiefdom, that is essentially carved out of a Gola, what was at the time thought to be a Gola area. And the president's uncle, Zwana Johnson, was one of those people who fought very hard against that. He was the clan chief at that point into the territory neighboring that, and in fact, in the middle of the night, moved the boundary posts at one point. But the central government came back in and said, no, this is where the boundary is going to be. That was an artificial creation for Mandingos. There are still a few Gola towns in that chiefdom, but it was designated by the central government as a Mandingo chiefdom. And I have to tell you that I have real concerns now with the new proposals that are before the legislature about boundary harmonization, about chiefdoms like this that are distinct entities that were historically created that might well get wiped out in the new legislation. But that's another issue. The point is that over time, Mandingos then obtained territorial areas. Now, added to this, and I think it is a more recent issue, my sense is, and it's actually during my lifetime, is that with the change in the political system in Guinea, and with the coming of independence with Second Tory and so on, many Mandingos fled Guinea and moved into Liberia, saw economic opportunities, now in new ways, new niches, taxi drivers, goldsmiths, a variety of tailors and so on. And so there was a new wave in more recent times of Mandingos into Liberia. And I think there is a confusion that exists when people think about Mandingos today, because they think probably more towards those more recent arrivals of Mandingos, and they lump them together with the older Mandingo residents here and say that they're all strangers. Don't realize that there is this older population that has been here for a very long time. The people in the Mecca chiefdom, you may well know this, don't speak Mandinka. They speak Bele. They speak a Bokomo form of Bele. It's not the same as spoken in Bong County, but it's Bele. That's their first language. It's not Mandinka. They happen to be Muslims, but they're not Mandingo speakers. But they carry the Mandingo surnames. And so I have an instance in a sense in my own family, because there's a family that was linked to my family going back to 1952, where three people, a father, son, and grandson, walking back from Mecca, stopped by Taylor's people, and were asked who they were, and they said that they were Chromos, and they were murdered, carried off to the St. Paul River, stones put around their feet, thrown into the river. They had nothing to do with any of the political issues going on, but because they carried the Mandingo name, they were lumped with all of the other Mandingos as being against Taylor. So there are distinctions that exist in terms of the Mandingo community, but the tendency is to think simply, if you like, and to think that all Mandingos are the same.
So can we say then that the move by the Liberian government at the time, in whatever stage of formation it may have been, that the move to exercise status control over these territories and impose centralized control, in a way, disenfranchised Mandingos to a large extent, and succeeded in creating the misperceptions or the perceptions that many Liberians have today of Mandingos?
Well, I don't think they were disenfranchised, because everybody was disenfranchised.
In a sense that...
in fact, they were recognized by the government as distinct by the creation of these chiefdoms for them.
Yes, agreed, but in the sense of, from the perception of local people, linking tribes to ancestral lands. Like for instance, the Loma can point and say, this is our ancestral land, Lofa, the Beles, though they are Kwa-speaking group from the southeast, but over the years migrated to this area, can say, this is our ancestral land. Now, except for this chiefdom, this Kwadubodi chiefdom that we refer to, I virtually know of no other area in which Mandingos can say, well, this is our ancestral land. And so, the point that I'm making is that the state, decision by the Liberian state in imposing central control over what were small city-states and what have you in the formative stages, sort of helped to drive this perception that people are aliens and do not belong to this body politic?
Well, first of all, I think you have to look at who's an ancestor and who's an ancestor. I mean, how far back are you going? The Loma or even the Bele are strangers to the land. It depends on what time point you want to start at and say, now this land is theirs. Because at one point they were strangers also. It's just that the Mandinka may have come more recently than some others. But then, you know, who has more right? And what the central government decided, vis-a-vis the Mandingos, was that even though they didn't have a territory that, quote, was their ancestral territory, in the sense that you're talking about, that given the nature of the political system that they were creating, and in which it was clear that Mandingos were seen as different, ethnically different from others, that they too should have a territory that was their own. And so that, if you like, was imposed upon the others. But in terms of enfranchisement, as you speak of that, I mean, they were all equally disenfranchised. If you're thinking in terms of vote, in terms of participation in government, and so on. But this allowed, at least in terms of the structure that was being created at the time, for the Mandingos to have chiefs who could be represented and could be recognized by the central government and could be worked with in the same way as others had chiefs, as opposed to an amorphous group of people who were sort of scattered everywhere, but who were seen by local people as different, but in fact didn't have a territory of their own.
Now, in your writings on Liberian history, you've written much about what is referred to as the Congo Confederacy. Now, for our purposes, could you say what was this Congo Confederacy? What objectives its formation sought to achieve, and how did the pursuit of those objectives impact settler and indigenous people relationships?
Okay, good. I'm actually the one who coined the phrase confederation for the group. It had not been used before.
Who were the dominant, which ethnic groups are the dominant elements of that confederacy?
Okay. Bandi, Loma, and Ningo. They're all part of that great trading route that existed from Musudugu or Musudu, depending on which history you have read about today, Musudugu, all the way coming south with Bopolo as a trading center, but coming through the Quaduboni area southward, and then to the coast, all the way between Bai country and Day country to the sea. This was a trading confederation, and there were various leaders who settled in Bopolo to create a halfway point, if you like, in the trade route for traders coming from their areas to the coast. And they came, in a sense, they lived in towns, and you can still find these distinct towns today in that area, that then populated, each ethnic group populated a distinct town. And they chose to band together as a group of people politically for the purposes of trading and for the purposes of defending themselves against the surrounding Gola. Now, the settlers found that confederation when they arrived here, and you know the history of Salboso helping the settlers to achieve their treaty with the local Day chiefs, and in a sense forcing them to accept the treaty that they signed. Salboso at the time was the leader of that confederation. He dies in about 1837, I think it is. He's the one, but he's working with a series of leaders of the other ethnic groups who are in that confederation in the surrounding towns. Their main purpose was trade. It was not agriculture. It was not any other thing than keeping a trade route open. They had problems with the Gola between themselves on the coast, and there was conflict there, particularly as the Gola also were pushing the Dey farther and farther towards the coast. The settlers linked because they needed trade goods and because they wanted to trade themselves. They interlinked themselves with the people in Buffalo. The McGill family took in Sauboso's son as a ward, and there were others who took in people from children from that area, or were given the children from that area, because that's a pretty common pattern. And so the settlers saw that advantage in terms of trade, and the people of this trading community saw settlers trading with the settlers as advantageous to themselves. So it's a mutual benefit. The problem came in the fact that the people of the Congo Confederation people wanted to trade in slaves, which they had been traditionally, and the settlers didn't want that. So that's where at times conflict occurred between them because of that objection on the part of the settlers. But basically it was to the advantage of the settlers to have open trade routes to Buffalo and on. They were never allowed to go beyond, traders, Liberian settler traders could go as far as Buffalo, but they were never allowed to go beyond Buffalo because the people in Buffalo didn't want to get bypassed. And so they held very tight to control beyond Buffalo. So there are essentially, I know of no settlers who go to the interior before in the 1850s because of that worry on the part of the Congo people that they would be bypassed. Now once Sauboso dies, his son takes over Holsoe, I think is his name, and his town is Totoquele, which is a town that still exists. And he built a two-story house for himself in Totoquele from his experience of seeing what the settlers built on the coast, and had furniture, Western furniture in his house and so on.
So can we say that absent the interpolation of the Liberian state or the formation of the Liberian state in 1822, this confederacy could have possibly evolved into a viable nation state?
It's interesting to speculate. I'm not sure that it would have. They were in severe conflict with the surrounding Angola in particular, who were not participants in this trade, were not allowed basically to participate in the trade. There were in the political structure itself was fairly amorphous, fairly weak. And there were problems of succession, particularly after Holsoe died. There are leaders that emerge, but there are periods of conflict in which this confederation weakens. Now, I'm not sure exactly when it finally expires as a group, but it's into the 1870s, maybe early 1880s. I don't see it, given the nature of the political structure. It had no territorial interests as such, because its main focus was trade. But who knows? I mean, it's hard to speculate on history and what would have been if this hadn't been.
Now
and I might add here, yes, you would have had Europeans on the coast, and maybe in time you would have had another colonial power move in. Liberia would not have been left unoccupied during the scramble for Africa. If it wasn't the Liberian settlers, it would have been the British or the French, or even the Germans at one point would have taken over. So Liberia would have been occupied one way or the other.
Okay, we should move on. In your presentation, you talk about distinct patterns of governance existing in the country among the traditional people, indigenous people. Like those in the south and the southeast, in contradistinction to those in the north central and northwest. In the southeast, the political structure being less hierarchical and more segmental, as opposed to the north, central, and northwest.
Right.
say can be the nexus between the two that can provide us a viable system of governance today? If one looks at the fact that, as you mentioned in your presentation, that governance is at the core of our problems, arising from an over-centralized state. So how could one draw a nexus, or what would you say would be the nexus between those two forms that can provide us a viable platform on which we can forge a new system of governance that will take into account all of our people and the participation of all its people?
All right, I think, by and large, given the nature of how we think of the political system, which in a kind of sense is hierarchical, even in the modern nation state of Liberia. I mean, I'm stretching it at this point, but I recognize it. What I had in mind, and I just allude to, I don't talk about it. In the United States, to use an area of example, we have in borough governments or in local city governments differing ways of governance. In some of these boroughs and cities, we have a strong mayor who is the executive mayor who holds power, and the city council who serves as a kind of legislature who pass laws. But there are other cities and boroughs where the borough or city is just a managing director, and power lies in the hands of the councillors on the city of the borough council. I live in a borough where the council has all power, and there's an executive director who takes action based on what the borough councillors tell him to do. He has no power onto his own. And it seems to me that kind of system where power lies in a council, a very group of people, would fit much better in the Southeast than a structure in which you have an executive who has power and in which the legislative part is separated from him. He runs, he manages, he makes decisions, or she, and the legislature only legislates, has no executive power in the sense of implementation. And it seems to me, if one can allow for that kind of diversity and keep thinking in terms of when new structures are imposed, you want to have townships, you want to have cities in Liberia, potential for that. But you allow then the local people to decide how they want to structure their governance within those entities. And you'll find, my sense is that what you'll find is in the Southeast, that you'll find a system where executive power lies in the commission with a executive who just carries out the decision, as opposed to a more hierarchical structure where power lies in the commission. That's what I had.
So, if I should say, implicit in that argument, some have argued there's a need for a polycentric form of governance to replace what is described as a monocentric form of governance. Then, how can this paradigm shift be realized?
Okay. I've given some thought to this, actually considerable thought to it, because I have, through the late 70s, early 80s, I have been mapping the whole of Liberia, looking at socialism process here, and I'm not a political scientist, so I don't tend to know all the ins and outs of all the possibilities of political structure. But I have a sense that what you really need to have functioning first and foremost is a legal system that everybody has trust and believes in. Because there is going to be, in the creation of these new counties where you have elected officials, there is going to be a lot of politics, a lot of shuffling about to gain power by individuals and by groups. And that shuffling, that confusion, if you like, has to be controlled by law. People do things that are illegal and they've got different reports in. Responsible. If you do it beforehand without a strong legal system, and who makes the decision about right and wrong? But I firmly believe that the time local government should be run by obviously the central government playing a central role and looking at the nation as a whole, responsible for the nation state. If you do that, you will also get far more responsible representation, not only at the local level, but I think at the national level as well.
How could this be achieved,
I think you're on the way already.
given the current dichotomy between statutory law and traditional law? And if I should illustrate, there have been a lot of calls for the abolition of trial by ordeal. But you have in some situations, in some parts of the country, where there's a lack of penal institutions, there's a lack of courts, you don't have lawyers, and in such instances, people are left with no recourse but to revert to traditional practices. Yet it is condemned, and one does not see how this dichotomy has been bridged. So against the background of what you say, how can one realize this and to make it not only functional but operational in the daily life of the people?
You honestly have to have a government that exists across the country. Part of government is the judiciary system that functions. It's not just enough to have an executive. Part of government function, you have to have the judiciary as well. That's what's going to happen. My sense is that's coming. It's coming in the poverty reduction strategy document. It's coming in terms of external forces urging the country on, providing money for the building of this legal system, training of people to run the system, and the structures, which is always easy. That's the easy part. It's the difficult part. I pointed out the issue of having a bed available across the country. What are the rules? What are the laws? Just one. You're right. Until such a time as that structure exists, you're going to continue to have dispute settlement based on what is possible, what people have been able to, what they've been able to do in the past. And in that dispute settlement, as you point out, rightly so, there are aspects of it that go against and now are considered human rights. And that is a challenge for the country to move in this direction. I don't think that up until now we have seen clearly the country, partly because of the nature of the executive branch, a strong push on to create a functioning and viable judiciary system across the country. Certainly in the past, the strong executives, the presidents, didn't want to see that because they wanted to control themselves, and they were in fact served as adjudicators, against the Constitution. Today, my sense is that there is a very strong desire now to finally have a fully functioning system. But law, from my point of view, if you're going to do
to seek redress for wrongs committed against individuals by the state or functionaries of the state. But more so, it found itself looking at cases that involve conflicts between neighbors, in and among neighbors. But somehow this petered out as the repression eased, so to speak, and so in a way that in the absence of this overarching state authority and state repression, in the absence of that now, people where before they were seeking mediation now have seemed to display the tendency to go towards litigation in the court. What kind of correlation can you draw from this?
Well, I think the correlation is that the system broke down. Seriously, people saw conflict and then going to the courts as a way of dealing with that conflict as opposed to trying to resolve the issue. Because in a court system, basically what happens is that the judge rules, one person wins, and one person loses. It doesn't fully. Now the weight of the state then backs up that decision. It doesn't not necessarily fully resolve the dispute. One of the litigants is not going to be very happy with the decision if he or she thinks that in fact if what one wants to be moving towards in this society is one of resolutions of disputes, of dampening these boundaries that have been created. So I'm talking about this color that I talked about. Then it seems to me that one wants to begin to move across the country towards first mediating disputes that exist on these boundaries and lines. And then, but only as a second and last resort, turning to the court to find the settlements, mediations, as people understand that they need to get along with each other. Now, this is the ideal, and I recognize that's the ideal. But I think that in the creation of this new legal system, building into it a mediation courts. I took the Danish example because I'm aware of it from the Danish West Indies, the former Danish West Indies, now running the West Virgin Islands, where I saw it in action in the documents in the 19th century. It was very effective. As a consequence, there was a very low court case load. As much of the disputes could be resolved by somebody serving as a mediator.
Now, also in your presentation, you talked about how the 1980 change, like the late from the Pandora's box, gave rise to latent conflicts that had been dormant all the while, and subsequently degenerating to the point where we had civil war. And you also, in the same presentation, argued for the imposition of central control, and you mentioned the introduction of all-male forces as a means of stabilizing the country and imposing central control. Now, my question is, how would the need for the imposition of central control resonate with attempts to engineer change towards a polycentric form of governance?
Well, I think that polycentric, again, I come back to the law. The law becomes the new dominant force, holding people in control. Not by force, although ultimately the law is bound up by force, but by the agreement on the part of the population. Because the law is what we created through our legislators to govern ourselves. But people have to have faith in the law. People have to have faith in the legislators that they are representing them and are passing laws that they agree should exist. So there has to be that kind of mental bonding on the part of the population that the law is for me. The law works are for me in the sense that I can, if I need to, go to the court, get a fair judgment. I don't think in the past that very many people believe, I may be wrong, but very many people felt that the court deserved to get a fair judgment. Say I may be wrong. A lot of the stuff was done on the basis of sort of seat of the pants. There has been some studies done, particularly in Denver County, of legal actions at various levels. By and large, when the judges rendered decisions, they rendered it on the basis of what they thought was fair, not on the basis of what the law necessarily said. Cognizant of what the law said. So there has to be this new system where people have faith in the judiciary to help them to live their lives fairly. And in that kind of a system, you can have it, you can then disperse power in the terms that you're using it polycentrically. Because there is a standard against which everybody has to act. And ultimately, what you hope is that people have sufficient faith and trust in the law that physical power does not have to be imposed. Obviously, they're going to be. You have to have police because there's going to be violence. But that, in the sense of a major political division or outbreak and so on, that doesn't occur. Because people have bought into the idea that we have a free and fair legal system. Now, I look to, it's idealistic in one sense, but nevertheless it exists. Costa Rica has no standing army. The nation of Costa Rica has no standing army. They have a national police force. They have not seen the need to have a national army. They have a color guard for ceremonial things. So it can happen. There is a country in which this exists.
But in a situation like Liberia and a post-conflict country like Liberia, placing it into a wider context with Sierra Leone, another post-conflict state, the Ivory Coast, for example, where we have seen the emergence of shadow economies, the emergence of shadow states and shadow economies, where conflicts are maintained. Even if the shadow state withers away, you still have remnants of shadow economies. Now, how would that impact, for the good or for the bad, on such attempts to impose central authority and at the same time develop polycentric forms of governance?
Well, obviously there has to be one standard for the nation. But within that one standard, there should be the possibility for variation that doesn't go against that standard. So there is certain freedom of movement and of design and of structure that fits locally. That's what you would get if you had county governments where they were responsive to the particular needs of the people in that particular area that may be different, quite different from another area. And that would include not only political issues, but it would include economic issues. And it might well allow for certain kinds of economic systems that are different from economic systems elsewhere, so long as it doesn't break the national laws. That's how I would see the dealing with this. So that there is flexibility, but within a general larger framework. And that includes both political as well as economic.
What would be the peculiar challenges in that regard? If, for example, you look at, again, Liberia, look at the case of the rubber plantations. There was a time when the Guthrie rubber plantation was under the control of ex-fighters, while you had a government elected to sit in place. Currently, you have a situation in Sino where the rubber plantation, the Sino rubber plantation is under the control of basically ex-fighters.
Yeah.
And according to reports, there are officials that are linked to this illicit economy existing within the boundaries of what you call a fully constituted state. So what would be the peculiar challenges in
Well,
this?
the central government has not achieved full control over all of its population. If you like, this is the Jew and Nimli of the 2008. I mean, there were small pockets until very late in Liberia that did not come under the full control of the government. But ultimately, everybody has to come under the control of the nation state, and that has to, unfortunately, it's probably going to have to be done by force, as it was done essentially, for instance, in Guthrie. People have to be forced out of these places, and that's why you are extraordinarily lucky to have the UNMIL forces here to be able to impose that brute force, if you like, to finally move the country to a single nation state. So that's the challenge. Even though you may have a democratic government, clearly the central government has not fully brought the whole country under control.
Okay, my last question. By your classification of traditional governance structures, South, Southeastern, North Central, and Northwest, one will observe that in the Southeast, and not particularly in the Southwest, clitoridectomy is much less pronounced and to a very large extent absent.
I didn't hear the word, the verb there.
Clitoridectomy.
Clitoridectomies. Okay, yes, yeah, I got you.
Is largely absent.
Right.
Or much less pronounced.
Right.
Now, that's Southeastern segment where, as you mentioned, patterns of governance differ as compared to other parts. Yes, and in a way, being more, in religious terms, influenced by animist and beliefs in Christianity. Now, if we look at the Northwest, and elements of the South and Central, clitoridectomy is part and parcel of the culture, and more pronounced, and in large measure influenced by religious beliefs, animist and Islam. What correlations, what can we draw, what parallels, if one will situate that within a larger context? What lessons can we draw?
In terms of why certain people do certain things and not others?
Yes, relating such social practices to governance on the ground.
Well, I'm not sure that I necessarily see a connection. I mean, this is part of the cultural diversity.
Would you say that it's more? Would you say that the accentuation of clitoridectomy in the North Central and Southwest can be linked in a way to the hierarchical control of such societies as opposed to the Southeast?
Yeah, I don't know that. I don't know that. I truly don't know. It clearly. I think what you have to go back to look at is the nature of the transition that individual societies, the structure that they create for the transition of children to adults, a transformation. And I have another idea actually here too, but and so certain societies choose to use certain mechanisms to demonstrate that transition, whereas others don't. You might add, if you didn't, but traditionally in the Southeast there was not circumcision either. Now that has become the rage today to do so because it's thought to be modern, but traditionally that didn't exist either. Now, there may be another part to this that just sort of comes to my mind. I can't prove this. I'm speculating now, totally speculating. what you may be seeing is this difference between in gender roles. And in the Southeast, where you have women who were much closer to being equal in their social and political roles than in the Central and North and Northwest, there is not the need to dampen the sexual urges of the women, because that's part of what lies behind clitoridectomy. It is to cause women and to dampen their sexual desires and to control women, to keep women in a distinct socially inferior position to men. And that would fit with the structures of the Central, North, and Northwest, the hierarchical structure, where you see women not in public roles, not in public political roles, but in secondary roles. I mean, they have their own world. I'm not ignoring that. Whereas in the Southeast, that distinction between men and women, in terms of their social roles and in terms of their political roles, is not seen as the need is not seen for differentiation between them. That would be one argument, at least, to explore as to why there is the difference that exists across the country.
Perhaps the Ministry of Gender would do well to consider gender dimensions that you refer to.
Well, but I think what you're seeing here is something else occurring, which we talked about a little bit earlier, and that is that what you're seeing now is a determination on the part of women of the world, if I may put it that way, to see this clitoridectomy as a human rights abuse that is independent of the local culture. There's a new standard that is being created, a human rights standard that is being created, that is being imposed upon societies around the world. And since Liberia is a signatory to that charter, obviously it needs to come in line with the thinking of that charter.
Well, as our DHS puts it, that in urban areas, urbanization does have an impact. There's much less inclination towards clitoridectomy in urban areas, particularly in Monrovia, as compared to rural areas.
Women have much greater freedom also.
Yes. Now, one last point. You mentioned, and that has to do with the socialization of people as a way of fostering and engendering, as well as enhancing national unity. You talk about exchanges, sending youths to work. Now, I noticed that, and considering the key role that sports, especially football, plays in our national consciousness, I wonder whether they lack. I didn't see that mentioned in your paper. I'm wondering whether it's an oversight or...
No, I thought I was going to be selective, but let's talk about football. I'm happy to talk about it. And I can tell you another story about football, which I didn't talk about either. Football is useful, and obviously the moving of teams around the country playing against each other is very good. The problem is that the teams don't stay for a period of time. They don't get to know the people. They're not resident. They're not living in people's homes. They don't see the way people do different things differently than each other. It's very good that people travel around the country. It's important that they see other parts of the country, and they begin to see Liberia as a whole.
And put a national team together with...
But I don't see that necessarily. And then there's the creation of a national team, of course, which people unify around when they're playing some other African country. Yes, exactly. And that becomes a significant for the day, as it were, for the time period. And I don't belittle that at all. There's another thing that went on. I couldn't fit it in here in an easy way. But in the southeast, among the Congo and Grand Chile, which was a society that had age grades, in which, particularly for males, where you belong to, depending on your age, you belong to a particular group, and as you move up to the next age grade, and then from that, when you got older, to the next one, and so on. And there's an age grade which is sort of after you are a child or a youth, that first period. Basically, we're talking about the late teens and 20s, maybe into the early 30s. And that was traditionally the warrior group. If there was going to be fighting, that was the group that did the fighting. But what the Congo did, and I'm not sure how this came about, they transformed fighting into football. So each village that had put their age grade members into a football team, and then they fought it out on a football field as opposed to fighting it out with weapons. And so that was an interesting transformation that occurred that used the old system, transformed it into something that was not harmful, but allowed these guys to get their aggression out against each other in a peaceful, in an essentially peaceful manner. So football has, there are interesting things that can be done with football, and I'm sure there's some other things that we can think about here, but because it is a national passion, that might be another way to integrate. It's essentially men, or males, and you want to make sure that you find a parallel for women.
Thank you very much. Sure.
Doc, I want to say thank you for your lecture this morning and giving us information, deep information about Liberia culture, its form of government, how it came about, trying to integrate the hinterland and the tribes with political government. This helped us with our work tremendously. You talk about President Arthur Barkley, that it was the first president who established a system of government which was modeled after the British for indirect rule. And he said Barkley organized an effective administration in the Liberian hinterland. I'll say further that it was in the northern part was placed, that's correct according to our history, and how he did it, he was able to use the frontier force of Liberia, because its northern part was placed under the efficient control of Colonel William D. Lomax. As we go about trying to bring names to history, we hope many who know the names of those who also played a part, that will be able to attach their names. And District Commissioner John W. Cooper, they were largely responsible for the successful initiation of this administration control. And the Frontier Force also rendered great assistance in this undertaking. Also, under Barkley, we see that the term of presidential office was extended from 2 to 4 years, because President Barkley served from 1904 to 1912. And since the E.J. Roy incident of getting loan, which was not well understood by many at that time, and especially his opponent, since the two-week party had just come into being, winning the other party. So your opponents look for anything, and once they have some mission, and especially when they tell it to the masses or anybody who not really informed, they can use that, do what they have to do, and maybe later, why they live to tell a story or don't live to tell a story, we all regret it in the end. But Barkley was able to obtain a loan in 1906 from the office of the London High Commission in London, the London Consul General at that time. In 1906, Barkley had a loan agreement effected in the London office of the Liberian Consul General, one Heyman, And the people who witnessed the signing of that agreement was Consul Hillman, M.L. Elijah, representative of the British brokers, through Harry Johnson, although he secured a loan. And signing for the Liberian government, we had this Liberia Development Company Limited, a company to whom Barclay had given a concession in Liberia. The loan, the annual interest was $30,000 to be paid semi-annually until completion of the payment of the loan. And the Liberia Development Company received $35,000 in addition to a yearly amount in profit on its road building work. That company took the loan to build a road, but according to history, Sir Harry Johnson Company received $200,000 for a road construction, and that company only constructed 15 miles of the road of the Carrot Boys district, placed a small boat on the St. Paul River, and bought 2 automobiles. And he announced that the $200,000 was spent. So that was another bad, very bad loan that we received since the E.J. Roy loan. But he was very effective, as we said, in the hinterland. So I want to say, yeah, that to add on to the acclaims of Barclay, Arthur Barclay. You talk about Edwin Barclay. Arthur Barclay was known as the Grand Old Man, and Edwin Barclay was this intellectual president who increased centralization of power. I think he also wrote the Lone Star Forever, Edwin Barclay. But according to the memoirs of C.L. Simpson, in his book, The Simmer of Liberia, which was written in 1961, it's also said that ex-President Barclay died later in the year at the age of 73, a bitter and disappointed man, because what he had gone through with the Coleman era and trying to come back to run. So with all what he did and considered to be, he died at 73, a bitter and disappointed man. Thank you very much, and my colleagues will continue. I have no questions.
May I comment?
Yes, please.
Be careful who you praise.
Yes.
I'm thinking particularly in terms of Lomax and Cooper.
John W. Cooper.
Yes.
Yes.
They are the ones who murdered the 8 chiefs in Congo and buried them in the common grave. And according to eyewitnesses, Lomax had the hearts cut out of the chiefs before they were buried and carried to his house.
That's the reason for bringing it up, because, like we say, history is written most time not by victims, but victors, and they will write it. They want it to be written. We did hear here about 48 kings coming down and buried, and people thought it was a myth. But sitting here, we know that through the exercise, many other information will be brought out, because people thought it was a myth. And that's what I brought out, the role of the frontier force, because it was the same frontier force, right or not, but that were used to collect taxes. And although it was the same indigenous brothers that was sent up country, they the one who tied the people and were brutal to them. So thank you, and that's the reason why I quoted what I quoted, because I wanted the open of the debate.
Do you want me to comment?
Yes, if you have more information, could you please enlighten us?
I don't know about the last incident. You're talking about 40 chiefs? Is that what you said?
No, yeah, someone came here and talk, I think it was Family, Dr. Family talked about some war where they killed 48 chiefs and buried them in mass graves. 13 chiefs, and buried them in Monrovia. Yeah, you know.
In Monrovia, okay.
That was our first time hearing it. You know, he didn't name the names of the chiefs, but he said that's what the people did. But what you said about hearts cut off or so, could you please repeat it?
Yeah, it's one of those. I discovered this recently in eyewitness accounts published in the British colonial records. I worked in 1968 in the Bandi country collecting oral traditions at the invitation of the Bandi paramount chief, Thomas Kola, and Augustine Jolla, who was the archivist here in Monrovia. And one of the, and I was sort of alluding to this in what I wrote. One of the things that kept coming up in all of the testimonies that I collected across the Bandi country was this killing of the traditional chiefs and burying them in the common grave. The disrespect that was shown. These were the people who were the supporters of Bomakole, who was the king, or the ruler of the eastern and southern Bandi, but and who was in opposition to his nephew, Mambo, who was being basically crowned as the king of the Bandi by Lomax and Cooper. It clearly was a cancer in their historical memory. They wanted to talk about in 1968 to me, all these years afterwards. I have known about this and have had this material since 1968, and I'm not necessarily proud of this, but I chose not to write it up, not to publish it, because I know it would have gone against national policy, national integration, and I would have been, by writing this up, undermining that national policy. So I chose not to publish it. I'm going to do it now, because we are now in a free Liberia where ideas can be talked about, no matter whether they're good or bad. I've been troubled by this through the years, and when I then discovered recently, I went to a conference in Germany, and it was a conference on historical memory, and I chose to talk about that whole incident because I thought it was an example where there was kind of amnesia. There was an article published in the 1970s. I don't remember who it was, and it's not important. In a journal published by the University of Liberia, where the author talked about Mambo and what a wonderful man he was, but nothing about this tragedy of the murder, because it was not political to do so. I'm sure there are many other incidences. If Dr. Fambolo has another one, but I'm not aware of this one that he seemed to be alluding to, but it doesn't surprise me. This doesn't mean that everybody was bad, but there certainly were incidents that were quite brutal. I happen to know a good deal about E.J. Roy because I've written a biography of him, and so I know a lot about the politics of that day. It was certainly freewheeling and quite open. There was not the strong central executive control that came later for differing reasons, and so the politics of the day was fierce. And E.J. Roy became a president only by one vote, because the decision was made in the House of Representatives. It was not, the election was contested at the end, and he meant well, but he was not not a successful leader, and he came in as a leader who only had the partial support of the general population. The loan is a tragedy also, certainly. He kept looking at the possibilities of what could be done in terms of development with the loan, but certainly the loan was not negotiated well, and the tragedy of it, of course, was that that loan hung over Liberia until 1952, was it? But the statue was out there in front of the university when the succession of loans were finally paid off during Tubman's time. And it's at that point then finally that E.J. Roy, who had been basically forgotten about, suddenly reemerges with the naming of the president's first motor yacht as the E.J. Roy motor yacht, and later he gets sort of brought back as important because of the founding of the Tory Party. But and certainly Barclay, who happens to be I have my favorites and my unfavorites in terms of presidents of the past, and Arthur Barclay happens to be one of my favorites. Reading his correspondence, Hillary Richard Wright Johnson is another one that I like very much, who took in the ward Robert Johnson, who was named Robert, who became named Robert Johnson, but who was dropped his name up at the president's grandfather. That's how the Johnson name comes about, because her grandfather was a warden. But Arthur Barclay, I think, was an effective president in many ways, although there were serious challenges to his presidency. And certainly, that early stage of trying to bring the interior under central government control was difficult. The thread through all of this history is that there was no money.
Yes.
And as a consequence, people knew what they needed to do, but the problem is that they didn't have the financial resources to do it. And so part of what you see in terms of the ineffective rule and so on is because there was not the funds to carry it out. It's not because the people themselves were incapable of doing it, but it was because they didn't have the resources. And finally, Edwin Barclay I find also to be a very interesting man. I just discovered on the internet from the Library of Congress collection, they put up online all of his poetry that they have in their collection. You mentioned the Lone Star Forever, but there's other poetry that he wrote. Yes, he died a bitter man. My sense is that the structure that he created during his administration, particularly the administrative structure, and particularly that of the hinterland, he began to see changed, I think is the nice verb here, by Tubman when he came in, and became very frustrated by how Tubman changed the structure in ways that he didn't feel was effective. And I think that's part of the reason for his running for office in 1955, and of course not being defeated. Clearly he did not he didn't see the direction that the country was going in under Tubman as one that he would have carried on if he could have, for better or worse. And I can't judge that in terms of, but he was, I think, a very good administrator. My sense is from reading his correspondence, and he spent, as I said in this piece, an inordinate amount of time adjudicating boundaries in the interior. It's why I worry about those boundaries that have been settled over many, many years now suddenly being ignored, potentially, by this new legislation that's coming in. Because it took a lot of time and energy to do that. It was part of not that there weren't weaknesses in all this, and certainly he had the League of Nations hovering over him in that early period, watching his every move. But I think under the circumstances, he was an effective president.
presentation. And thank you very much for the support of the DRC process. On page 6 of your presentation, the second paragraph, you say in all parts of the country, there are very weak mechanisms to create and maintain peace, particularly between warring entities larger than local lineage, groups or clusters of related villages. In the southeast, for instance, among the Crown, there was sufficient land so that the conflicting groups would just move apart. In more densely areas, as long as along the coast, for instance, among the Grebo, there was a very long-standing antagonism between the Creamerware and the Newmanware, which periodically spilled over into warfare, but which ultimately died by sheer lack of means to continue the support of the conflict. This is very interesting, and then these issues are still in existence.
Yes.
And my question now is, what can we do? The first, what was the root cause of the conflict between the Newmanware and the Creamerware? What is the way forward? Because in our visit, we have visited all the 15 counties. The problem between, even though there's no mechanism in terms of supporting warfare among the tribes now, but the tensions are still there.
Yep. Land is the core issue there. They have such limited land. They are squeezed up against the sea and have limited land. So, to my mind, there may be more to it than that, and there's been some very good work done, at least in the period before, up until 1910. But it seems to me it revolves around land, access to land. And you have colonies from both of these clans creating enclaves, certainly in the past, up along the Kavala River, going way up, as far as where the old Firestone plantation was. Little enclaves along the river that became farming enclaves because they needed to find other places to farm. But again, they began to compete and to contest land, even in those areas, because again, there was a limited amount of land. So there may be other issues underlying this as well, but I think, because as I say, there often are underlying conflicts that don't bubble to the surface. But I think the overt one here is land. And now how to deal with it? It seems to me, first of all, there has to be a changing economic base. And it may well be that they can't farm for rice anymore because land is so limited. And they need to find other economic mechanisms to survive. And that's part of what the modern day state needs to be looking at in terms of how can these people effectively find occupations to support their families. Some of that occurred through the rubber plantation. People worked for the rubber plantation and carried or sent money home. And there are, of course, later where there was the palm company, palm oil company that started as well. So what one has to look at is economic access. There will, I think, probably because there is such a long heritage of conflict between these groups, it will be used whenever possible, not unlike ethnicity is used, because this, in a sense, is a kind of ethnic identification. And what one has to try to assure is that in political access and in judicial access, that they have equal and fair chances to be heard or to speak. If you have so that, for instance, to come back, because I am troubled by this, it's none of my business in one sense, but the boundary harmonization, those two groups should not be lumped together in one political unit, because they will not get along. It will be constant friction unless there is some way to represent, for them to each be represented in a way that they feel they fairly have fair access to and fair voice. In a county structure, each of their areas seems to me has to be a separate political area that has representation. So one has to look at, we recognize there's a tension there. There is a boundary of tension. So one then has to look at that boundary and say, all right, how do we diminish that tension? What are the core issues of why they are fighting, or they continue to fight? And then how do we look at changing that base for contesting each other?
Thank you very much, Doug.
Thank you very much, Doug. We are happy that you took off your time to come and address the commission at this time. This is a manifestation of your interest in the well-being of the Liberian people. As a follow-up to questions that were given to you by Commissioner Stewart, I would like to find out from you, because you appear to be someone who has certain knowledge of Liberian history. Did you ever come across of a report that was written by a former U.S. Naval Commando in the persons of W.R. Suffolk on the 18th of January 1876?
I know who he is. I know that he was asked to be the mediator in the boundary dispute between Liberia and Sierra Leone. I'm not sure which report you're thinking of. There was also some naval survey work done on. I think it was the St. Paul River. But I'm not sure specifically. Tell me what you know about the report, and I'll tell you whether I know it specifically. I know who he is, though.
In that report, he recommended to the American Colonization Society the moral and physical conquest of the Gribble and the Mandingos. And the rationale behind that recommendation was that the Gribble are warrior, and they agreed for gain and power, and that the Mandingos are a crusader in the name of Muhammad.
No, I don't know this report. It's fascinating. I don't know that report. The Grebos. When is the Confederation that occurs? That's, I guess, 2 years later, isn't it? In 70, I think it's 78. No, I don't know. This is new to me.
Please.
I'd love to see it or get a reference to it, because I'd be happy to look at it.
Please, when you go back, try to ask.
Yeah.
Go to the Black Congress and ask for the 1876 report. And,
it's at the Library of Congress?
Yeah, the Black Congress. The Black Congress.
Black?
Blacks. Black.
Spell.
Black. U.S. Black Congress.
Okay.
In your paper, you said that before the arrival of the American returnees, there were two major political systems in Liberia, in the areas now known Liberia, and that one of the major political systems was the Congo Confederation. This confederation was led by the Mandingos, King Buswa, or King Sabuswa as you may call it. Yet in other parts of your document, you said the Mandingo brought Islam here and they came to this part of the country in search of cola nut and commodities. Is it a contradiction?
Why is there a contradiction?
If a major political system was already in this part of the country and was led by Mandingo, you think by a mere search of cola nut would be the purpose of your trip or travel here?
No, it's much more than cola nuts. It's salt, it's slaves, it's access to European goods. There's a wide variety of things that are being traded. They came as traders, but then they carried with them also Islam, because that was the religion. That was their religion. But they were traders. They were interested in they were merchants.
Being a trader as a profession,
right,
and undertaking expedition, that's two different things.
Expeditions. What kind of expeditions?
If you read the history correctly, every tribe in Liberia were forced to migrate to this place as a result of some conflict. And Mandingos were among those that wanted to come buy cola and commodities.
Okay. Some may have been forced, but others certainly came of their free will because there were economic opportunities.
You also talk about promulgating a unified law so as to alleviate what you refer to as trouble boundaries. How do you go about formulating unified law in a country that is multi-religious, multi-cultural, and multi-tribal society? How do you go about?
By being sensitive to that diversity, by taking into consideration the various forms of, if you want, religion or law, whether I don't know how strong there is a push for Sharia law in Liberia, but it may well be that it is occurring. I have a sense that in the Vai country there is a movement in that direction towards much more conservative form of Islam. All of that has to be taken into consideration when one is creating a legal system that everybody buys into. Because that ultimately is what you have to have if you're going to have a functioning nation state. And so in the writing of aspects of the law, that diversity has to be first understood and then ultimately has to be incorporated into a system that is tolerant of the diversity.
It may interest you to know that the phrase Sharia is an Arabic language.
Yes.
And in your language, the definition of Sharia is law.
I recognize that but in speaking English, we tend to basically repeat the word. And we talk in terms of Sharia law because most people don't know what Sharia means. And so in order for them to understand, one adds the word law. But you're absolutely right.
Thank you very much. much for your presentation and your patience in answering our questions.
Happy to do it.
As one commissioner said, understanding the Liberian English as well.
I've lived here a long time.
You highlighted centralization as the historical source of conflict in our country. Maybe we want to emphasize over-centralization. But I was wondering, isn't centralization inherent in a body structure as Liberia is? Even though we have 16 tribes, but yet we have a very small territory, a very small population, and the major resources are naturally centralized.
Is that a justification for a dictatorship? I don't think so. I think one wants to see a liberal democracy, ultimately. I think that's the hope of most people. They want representation, they want to be heard. Of course it's complicated. It would be very simple if everybody were Danes and they all came out of the same cultural heritage and they didn't have diversity. It's much, much simpler to govern in that setting. I speak of Danes because that's my heritage. My parents were Danish and all my family's in Denmark, so I know that. Of course, to govern a country that is as diverse as Liberia is difficult, and particularly when you're trying to create a legal system, a governance system that is new to, if I put it that way, to a majority of the population. And that maybe it was necessary to have a period of centralized domination to allow for the spreading of Western education, if you like, whatever you want to call it, formal education across the country, for the chance for more people who are come out of these diverse groups to be able to speak, as it were, the same language with the dominators, and to be on an equal footing to challenge. And so one might argue that it was necessary to have this period of dominance until that occurred. But what we saw, starting in the late 70s, as more and more of the young men and women came back from the States and from other places with formal higher education, who were from other ethnic groups than that of the suburbs, that they began to speak and to challenge the people who were in power, and ultimately leading to what happened. Well, I think what one has now is the opportunity, having gone through this horrible experience, where you have very widespread formal education. One of the ironies of this conflict, one of the supreme ironies, is all of the people who fled, so many to America, who had a chance to get formal educations and to use those formal educations. Liberia has the potential of a gold mine of people who can speak to each other as equals and who can move towards the running of a modern nation state. I'm not saying that people who didn't get that can't do it, but what I'm saying is that the potential for as many people as there are who have gotten that opportunity, that there is a better chance to move towards greater harmony. I'm not saying there was no way that I could justify what you all have gone through the Civil War. It was too horrible. But there is a bitter irony in that there may be a silver lining in this. And so I think, having gone through this long experience, not only the centralized domination, but the Civil War, that now is an opportunity for equal voice to be heard from people across the country who can speak to each other in the same language and with the same core understandings. create now a integrated, tolerant society of diverse peoples. This is not a unique situation. We see many examples in Africa. We see examples in other parts of the world as well. It's a challenge. It's an enormous challenge. But I think that there is a real opportunity now. And I have a sense that you have a government in power that wants to do this.
That takes us to political and governance decentralization. There is a fear, I don't know if you share the fear, of creating ethnic enclaves. We do have 15 counties growing out of the need to be a little bit independent, or out of the need to create a more liberal political system that extends across the country. But then you have 15 counties, 15 tribes, or 16 ethnic groups. How extensive can political decentralization be without reinforcing ethnicity in our body politic?
Well, in an ironic sense, I actually was that person in Washington in that seminar who proposed ethnic counties and was roundly drummed out as a way to dampen ethnic conflict by saying, fine, all right, you have your own area now. You govern your own area and stop worrying about what the other people are doing. It may be a step in the direction towards greater harmony. But there is a problem in this, in that you get political units that ultimately, if one moves towards decentralized government, really can't support themselves. They're too small. They don't have enough people to support the bureaucracy that is necessary for a county government. I see that process. You're at a point now where you have 15 counties. That's a reality. And I don't think it makes sense to say, all right, tomorrow we're going to abolish this county or that, because you're going to open a hornet's nest. But I think over time, as decentralization occurs, and as people in particular counties begin to realize that there's an economy of scale here, they may begin to think, maybe it isn't so important to be an ethnic county. Maybe we should join with the neighboring county and become a larger force in national politics. I think it will dampen the move towards the other sub-political units that there has been pressure for. Now, I know that the new legislation wants to abolish everything and start all over again. Again, I have some problems with that. But the point is that what you want to do is get people to realize themselves that this doesn't make sense, and then ultimately say, fine, we need to find some way to make the system work for us, rather than having it imposed upon them. So that's my hope over time. I mean, you have, at least I haven't looked at them all carefully on the basis of this new estimated census for just the counties, but you have such enormous disparity between a county like Nimba or Bong or even Lofa, something like River G or River Sess or Crew Coast. And I think in time people are going to realize that some of these units are probably not viable. But they've got to come to that realization themselves. It should not be forced on them, now that one has reached this stage.
So how much value would you attach to the argument that ethnicity is not deeply rooted in the psyche of the Liberian people, but it is a factor that has been exploited by ambitious and selfish politicians, and then by despots or autocratic rulers who thought that by whipping up ethnic sentiments and strengthening their political base.
As I said, and I think that it is, much to my dislike in saying this, I think that people look for how they can get ahead of somebody else. And they will use whatever mechanism they can to win their argument. Certainly that's the way my mother argued with me. She found everything wrong that she could and used that against me when she was arguing, even if it had nothing to do with the argument. Ethnicity is a reality. People still identify themselves by their ethnic origins. It's important to people. But people use religion, they use a variety of things, gender, they use, I've pointed out a series of areas of dispute. So that what you want to do, it seems to me, is to try to find mechanisms to dampen, as I've said before, some of these areas, and maybe even move to creating laws so that you cannot use ethnicity against somebody. For instance, hiring and so on, as we have moved to disallow race in our civil rights law as one of the things that cannot be used against people, gender, a variety of other things, disability, and so on. That one adds ethnicity to that civil rights in Liberia. It's not going to go away. It's a reality that is here. And the question is how to manage it.
Last question focus on land. Prior to the coming of the settlers, there were existing governance structure, which in my mind points to control of the land, ownership of the land, and all of that. I'm wondering, how much did government contribute to land disputes as it has manifested itself and resulted to violations of human rights? Weren't there treaties signed in time past between the government and the settlers? How were these people dispossessed? Were there any form of compensation? Somebody at one point in time suggested that there was direct purchase. Another person said no, there wasn't direct purchase. Instead, there were gifts given. But the lands weren't meant to be sold to the returning brothers and sisters of Africa who were once enslaved in America.
There are two parts to your question. The one was prior to the arrival of the settlers, and the second was the arrival of the settlers. It seems to me. My sense is that, and I said that here, is that land is not a major area of contention, except in very limited parts of what is modern-day Liberia in the past, in the pre-settler period. Land was great, population was sparse. When I came to Liberia in 1951, the estimates were that the population of Liberia was under 1 million people, somewhere around 800,000 people. And that was in 1951. If we go back to 1821, the population was probably quite small. So the main issue was the control of people to work your land, to make farms. People were power. Chiefs had lots of children, had many wives, so that they could make farms to have greater resources than the next person who didn't have so many. The land was basically readily available in most parts of the country. So that my sense is that it's not until the coming, and this is basically in the 20th century with the imposition of interior rule and governance and the creation of clans and chiefdoms, as I said, and boundaries are created, then land becomes problematic. In terms of the second part of your question of the agreements that were made between settlers and local people over territory, it's problematic. It's not clear to me, and it's not clear in the documents, whether in all cases the documents. I think that the concept on the part of the settlers was that they were gaining sovereignty over the territory that they were required, and that the gifts that they gave to the local chiefs gave them full sovereignty. It's not written necessarily into the treaties, however, so that's where it's partly problematic. And from the concept of, I think, all of the peoples that they dealt with along the coast with these treaties, I don't think that any of the people fully comprehended that the settlers were thinking in terms of full sovereignty, that in the signing of these treaties that they were alienating their territory from their political control. What they saw probably in most cases was that these were kinds of treaties that allowed them to interact with the settlers in a free and peaceful manner by these treaties that are created, but that they would have rights, continue to have the rights that they had before in terms of the use of the land and so forth. And there, of course, is where some of the conflict arose, because there was a misunderstanding from the very beginning as to they were, in a sense, speaking past each other. And because the settlers ultimately had more power, political force, they had more force, they won the day. So that's my reading of those early treaties. I've looked at a great number of them. My sense is, in the long and short, is that the people were speaking past each other. Each group was speaking past the other.
Thank you very much, Dr. Holsoe.
You're welcome.
For both your presentation and the responses to the questions, and then the recommendations you have advanced for national unity, peace, and reconciliation in Liberia. We thank you very much for coming and making these presentations.
Thank you for inviting me. I appreciate the invitation. I have appreciated the chance to speak with you, and I hope that my comments have some usefulness.
It has been, certainly. Thank you very much. Mr. Hearing Officer, the Commission will now adjourn for today and resume tomorrow at 10 a.m. with Dr. Augustine Connor and President Commission. Thank you.
Thank you, audience.